seeking the truth here on the show. That's what we do.
All right. Remember when the Western media loved to poke fun at Sweden for refusing lockdowns, and then furthermore poke fun at Fox News for loving Sweden for lockdowns? You remember this, right? Sweden was like the kick me sign of the pandemic. Right. Well, now the country may be able to say, I told you so. Not that Sweden is gloating. They're not. But the lead epidemiologist there, it was sort of like their Surgeon General, said that it would take years to know if these non-lockdown policies actually paid off. But it seems that this year we have some data showing that it is, especially when you consider that countries with strict lockdowns, such as the UK, are experiencing such negative data. So we're going to compare. Now, the UK is experiencing a surge we've been talking about in excess deaths since the pandemic, but they also are having a surge in cancer death. According to The Telegraph, charities and health experts are calling for the government to act, warning that misdiagnoses during lockdown may be a factor, and that the problem is being compounded by the current NHS crisis. Since the beginning of September, there have been nearly 900 more deaths in people with cancer than would be expected at this time of the year. The most recent breakdown of causes of death from the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities show there were nearly 230 extra deaths in the worst week, that week alone, of people dying from cancers that either were misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. Early diagnosis, they say, can improve your chances by up to 30%, depending on where you land on the stage 1 through 4. Now, the health secretary is defending the National Health Services and saying, yeah, it's bad, but we're kind of doing what we can. We expected this. He really has a pitiful response when pushed on this. Listen.
You use the word challenge a lot. I want to show our viewers what challenge really means. We can look at this graph. You might want to look at it as well. The number of patients who have to wait over 12 hours before getting onto a ward when they arrive at A&E. Look at that spike.
And in a way, Laura,
that's not a challenge. That's a disaster,
that makes
isn't
my
it?
exact point. You can see the extent to which that has risen exponentially since the pandemic. So the point I was making was in terms of where, from the Labour Party here, this being a 12-year issue, you can see there's been a very material impact from the pandemic, and it's in that context that we've taken the difficult decision on social care, whilst we remain committed to those reforms, to delay them for 2 years, which frees up the £6.6 billion investment into our NHS, but also the 2.8 and 4.7 billion that goes into care.
But can you look at that as Health Secretary and tell our viewers this morning that this system is working?
Well, that's why we're put with the very difficult...
My question, can you tell people that the NHS is working right now?
I recognise, Laura, that it is under severe pressure, and that RAF illustrates that. That is why, despite the very real challenges in the autumn statement that the Chancellor faced, he prioritised funding for health, an extra 6.6 billion over the next 2 years.
But it's less than they asked for. It's less than they say they need.
Well, the Chief Executive of the NHS was clear. This gives the NHS the funding that it needs. But we have also, alongside that, recognised that simply focusing on the NHS without also focusing on care will not actually address the issue of delayed discharge.
Which is why some people wonder why you're delaying the reform, but we've talked about that.
Now, I just want to show a little empathy here, because if you've ever gone to the doctor and had them say anything scary at all and say, oh, we want to test you for this, and then you cannot get an appointment to follow up to verify whether or not you have this or your child has this, I've been through that kind of thing with my kid where they're like, this might be this, let's get it tested. And then you agonize. This is agony to not be able to get information about your own health. Take a look at this. There's 7 million people on the NHS waiting list in England as of October, and they say that's just going to get worse into 2025. It says new data from the NHS England show that the number waiting to start routine hospital treatments at the end of August was up 6.8 million in July, the highest number since records began in August of 2027. Now look down a little further, some 461,400 patients, 30.5% of the total, were waiting longer than 6 weeks for one of 15 standard tests in August, including an MRI scan, ultrasound, and gastroscopy. Again, if you can just feel for those people who are thinking, oh my gosh, I might have something. I can't get an answer to even get an appointment for 6 weeks, what that feels like, what the agony is of going on with your life with that uncertainty. And they say this is just going to get worse. Now, when we do compare this to Sweden, though, which did not do what they called lockdown experiments, the numbers are hard to argue with. This is Anders Tegnell. He is the Swedish state, like their sort of surgeon general, said that he could not recommend lockdowns given he didn't know if they worked. That was his official policy. He said they'd never been proven, so he didn't want to risk it. In hindsight, that is really logical.
Yeah.
They weren't proven. How did we know that that was going to work? Why did we all agree to that? And I'm going to see in the chat many people saying, I didn't. But I get you. Now, this radical approach actually cost him a job with the World Health Organization. In April, the Swedish Public Health Agency announced that Tegnell would leave his job and join WHO as a senior expert working with vaccine distribution. But then after he left, the WHO kind of played this dirty joke on him and said, sorry, we never could come to an agreement on his contract. He doesn't really have a job here. So that's interesting, right? He's this sort of pioneer in anti-lockdowns, thinks he's being moved on up to the WHO, and then they kind of pull the rug out from under him. I did not have time to look further into this story today, but I'm interested in it. If anybody knows something extra, wants to point me in any direction, I'm all eyes. Now about those Swedish statistics. The Telegraph reports that in Sweden, in February, when they abolished all domestic COVID restrictions, Sweden emerged with one of Europe's lower COVID death tolls. The rate is 1,614 per million people, just over half that of Britain. Given that British death tolls were comparable at first to Sweden, it's hard to argue that there's some demographic force which meant COVID was not going to spread the same in Sweden. Again, now we see Finland, though, coming back around on those COVID death numbers and saying we attributed a lot of deaths to COVID when they were deaths with COVID. We may or may not see Sweden do that because Sweden was included in some of that analysis from the Finnish government. So we're going to have to wait on that. Now let's look at cancers, at economic growth, rather. When you compare Sweden, their GDP fell by 2.9% in 2020, while Britain's collapsed by 9.4%. Both have bounced back. Again, this is written in February, though, before we had this hell of a year that we've all somehow survived. Now, though, in February, they were estimating that Sweden's economy would be 5% larger than before the pandemic, so got back to a growth pattern versus 2% for Germany. The UK will be about 1%, one of the lowest figures in Europe. Again, these are February numbers. I think those are increasingly optimistic, but data usually relates increase in GDP to increase in health for all manner of reasons. When GDP raises, individual people see an increase in income and are able to buy themselves a healthier lifestyle, whether that be replacing indoor cooking, facilities or eating better or what have you. These are all very preliminary measures, but ones we absolutely should keep in mind if and when we are ever asked to make sacrifices during a lockdown again.
Someone says, Dynastropes in the chat says, the reason the Swedes didn't lock down is because of the Swedish constitution, but the Swedish government changed that a few weeks ago. I didn't hear that part.
Yes, I am interested in that. Send that to us.
Also, the people wondering, I was wondering why Sweden didn't take a victory lap in this. Hey, and apparently that's part of their law too, but it's a cultural law. The law of Jante. Jantelagen, the law of Jantelagen, where Swedes don't show off.
Okay. It's a Swedish virtue.
Why my laptop stopped working? It's a Swedish virtue. Swedish Jantelagen, law of Jante. Why Swedes don't show off is, So it's a little custom. And it's basically called Jantelagen, the law of Jante, because it says that you're not better than anybody else. So if you do something extraordinary, they are less prone to bragging in Sweden. I love that. Don't show off. You got a new car? Don't show off. Got a new house?
Socialist.
Don't show off. If a number of record sales, fancy furniture, don't show it off. Just don't show it off.
Okay, I'm all for that.
I love that. Do you see my new glasses?
They're not new.
I'm just showing off.
Oh, okay.
I'm not Swedish.
All right. Well, let us know what you think in the chat, this sort of cultural difference between COVID lockdown approaches and how we will all be better or worse because of it.